the words I have spoken. There are no 4 words I regret more than what you see now. Those 4 words have defined me for millennia, defined me by my failure, and defined me by my pride, my stubbornness, my bull-headedness. And now I see just how wrong I was, and I stand before you without excuse, but I would hope that you could at least offer me some understanding and just consider that maybe you would have found yourself in the same place. My name is Thomas. No doubt you've heard of me. I was chosen by Jesus, not just a follower, not just a disciple, but an apostle, one who was sent to take the message. And I took the message, I preached, I taught, I traveled, I served. But my unfortunate legacy, what I seem to be most known for, are those 4 words. Doubting Thomas. You've said it, haven't you? You said doubting Thomas. Maybe you've had it said about you. Matthew, I read Matthew's gospel. Matthew is so careful with the prophecies and listing all of the quotes. Luke is so careful and meticulous with the timeline, getting everything in order. Mark is just excited and writes his very quick little gospel, but then it was John. It was John who included those words, my shame. John, the disciple who Jesus loved. He loved us all, John. But it was John who recorded those words, my shame, in his gospel. You'd find them in your Bibles in John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29. Before he left, your preacher told me to tell you that if you look at those blue Bibles in front of you, it's on page 907. But it's there in verse 25 that John records my words to him, my words to Peter, my words to the rest of them, unless I see the nail marks in his wrist, unless I put my fingers in those marks, unless I put my hand into his side, my words. Please understand, I was not there on that glorious Sunday that you are celebrating today. I was not there when Jesus revealed himself. I was not there in the garden with Mary at the tomb. I was not there with Peter and John as they raced to the empty tomb, as they looked in, and as John would remind you, I outrun Peter. I was not there while the others were in hiding behind locked doors, fearing that if the Romans did this to Jesus, they might do this to them. Fearing that if the Sanhedrin had done this to Jesus, that they would be next. They were all locked in behind the doors, afraid. I alone left. I alone went out for food. I alone went out for supplies. I was the brave one. But that's my legacy. Those words define me. In my defense, I mean, you've said it yourself, haven't you? Seeing is believing, right? You've said that. Seeing is believing. And prior to that day, I had seen exactly as many crucified, as many resurrected people as you had. I had seen as many resurrected bodies as you have. 0. Yes, I had seen Lazarus raised after an illness, raised after 4 days. I had been in the town of Nain with Jesus and the others when Jesus raised that poor widow's son, her only son, when he raised him to life and gave him back to her. But this was different. This was crucifixion. This was a body tortured and mangled on a cross, drained of every drop of blood and left as a lifeless husk. I had seen crucifixion. I had seen the results. And the possibility of life, of resuscitation, of restoration, resurrection, that was too much to believe. Something held me back. Maybe Maybe it holds you back also. I needed more than just stories. I needed more than just the excitement and the happy songs that other people seem to find to be completely adequate. I needed proof. I needed something I could examine, something I could touch, something I could feel, something I could see. And it's not that I didn't want to believe. I wanted to believe, but without that evidence, without that proof, I could not. I would not. And yet for some, it's so easy. It comes so easy to trust, so easy to take Jesus at his word. I remember when we were in Bethesda. There's a pool there, and there was a man laying at that pool. He had been paralyzed and laying there for 30 years, drawn to that pool by the claim that once in a while an angel would come down, would stir up the waters, and the first one in would be healed. And yet he had laid there for 30 years. For 30 years he had never gone into the water. For 30 years he had never tested its promises. And that day we met him, Jesus encountered him, looked down, and Jesus simply said to him, "Do you want to get well?" Did I want to believe? I believe I wanted to believe. I believe I wanted to, but without proof. Without proof, what was I to do? That man had excuses. No one will carry me to the water. Whenever the water stirred, someone else gets in before me. I had excuses. Unless I put my fingers in the marks in his wrist, unless I feel the hole in his side, Do you have any unlesses? Do you have any excuses? Maybe we all do. Maybe we all have our excuses. Maybe we all have that one need that holds us back, that one need that keeps us from believing. Seeing is believing, right? Or is it? What if believing isn't about seeing? What if believing is about doing? What if believing is about moving forward despite our doubts? It had been a week. It had been a solid week. I want you to consider that. It had been 8 days by the Jewish reckoning of a week, from Sunday to Sunday. 8 days. I held to my convictions for 8 days. 8 days of Mary telling us, "I saw him at the tomb. He called me by name." And I held to my convictions. 8 days of Peter and John saying, "We went to the tomb. We saw the grave clothes. They were laying there. The towel was folded up and laid in place." And I held to my convictions. And then Cleopas came back. Cleopas and his friend came back after walking to Emmaus and encountering Jesus. Cleopas said, "Our eyes were open when he broke the bread. My eyes remained tightly shut." For some, belief came so easy. For some, belief comes so easy. I think about that man at the pool. I think about him. Jesus finally said to him, "Get up, take your mat, and walk." 30 years he had laid there, 30 years of excuses. And he abandoned his excuses like that. And he walked. Why? How? I know Jesus healed him, but what made him believe in himself that he could stand? What made him take that first impossible step? What made him do the impossible and trust that because Jesus said it, he could do it? My excuses. Only 8 days of excuses, but 8 days behind locked doors, 8 days behind locked doors, fearing for our lives, 8 days of me holding to my convictions. And I looked up, and there he was. There he was, standing right in front of me. It was like he had always been there. You think about that loved one that you've lost. You think about that loved one and how they always sat in that one chair in the living room. And after they're gone, you walk in and you still expect them to be sitting in that chair. And then in that moment you realize, no, they're not going to be there. It was like that, except he was there. Except he was standing there right in front of me for a moment. And then there he was. And he was there. The locked doors didn't keep him out. My doubt did not keep him out. He stood right there before me. The paralyzed man, 30 years paralyzed in his inability to walk, it didn't keep Jesus out. And whatever it is that keeps you from trusting, keeps you from believing, trusting in his love for you, his forgiveness for you, his purpose in your life, that doesn't keep him out. And I tell you this, whatever your doubts, whether it's a doubt you have about him, whether it's a doubt you have about yourself, whether it's a doubt you have about his church, Jesus is willing to meet you at your doubts. There he stood before me. I had last seen him on the cross, hands and feet nailed to the cross. That's when I ran. That's when I left. But he stood before me alive, and he walked to me, and he looked me in the eye. He looked through me. He knew me, not just that he knew me, but he knew the words I had said for 8 days. He knew my demands. He knew those words. And in that moment, I was more paralyzed than the man at the pool. For that man, it was simple. Take up your mat and walk. He took up his mat and he did just that. But me, Jesus held out his wrist. I could see the hole that went all the way through. I could see the nail marks. And in that moment, I froze. I recoiled. I was the one who was paralyzed. And so he took my hand and he pulled it. And he pulled me to his wrist and he pushed my fingers into that hole. And then he lifted his tunic and he showed me the hole in his side where the spear had pierced him, the hole where blood and water had poured forth, the hole where his life had drained out, the hole that led all the way to his pierced heart, his broken heart, his heart broken for me. And again, he took my wrist and he dragged my hand into that hole, into that wound. And he looked me in the eye and he said those words to me, "Do not disbelieve. Believe." It was a warning. It was a warning that there was a crossroads ahead of me. There were two paths I could take. Either path would have a world of doubts on them. There would always be doubts in front of me, but I could allow those doubts to paralyze me and put me on a path I could never escape. Or I could allow Jesus to meet me at my doubts, not just meet me there, but call me to move ahead despite them. And in that moment, my only response was to recognize him for who he had to be, my Lord and my God. And you know, in that moment, he told me about you. He told me about you. This might surprise me, but he told me about you that day. Not you by name, but you by your experience or you by your lack of experience. He told me about you by your doubts. Jesus looked right at me and he said, "Thomas, have you only believed because you've seen?" He was right, of course. I had seen, I had touched, but that's not faith. That's privilege. Faith is something more. Faith has to be something more. And for faith to be greater than our doubt, it can't be about touching marks. It can't be about seeing the wounds. It has to be about how our faith touches us and touches our hearts. And that's when he mentioned you. And he told me about his promise to you. Yes, Jesus had shown himself to me. Yes, I had declared the truth about him based on what I had seen, based on what I had felt, my Lord and my God. But he said about you, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And there is a greater promise for you, for a faith that persists despite your doubts. And so I ask you today, will you give him your life? Not just your life, but will you give him your doubts? And I promise you this, in this church there are people who love you. There are people who value you. There are people who want the very best for you. There is room here for you, and there is room for your questions. There's room for doubt, and room for you to find your answer, your hopes, your belongings, and for you to find Jesus. And like so many others here, more blessed than me, room for you to declare, my Lord and my God, and room for you to say those words. You ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart.